here today with Ferdinand Von Galen, who's the author of the book, Why America? And thank you for being with us today, Ferdinand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited that we're going to read your book in our class, which is a project class on globalization. And we're doing field research in Tucson.
Town I know well.
I thought the unique thing that your book brought for the class was that we have German students that are focusing on Tucson, and so that your background helps them to understand a unique perspective of like the intercultural look at the American landscape. I thought I might take a moment to ask you about like your background and your argument for why you thought America was unique. Kind of like, you know, why did you choose to write the book?
So the idea for the book came up is I've been spending time in the US most of my life on and off as a student and coming here in the summers. But at some point, despite all that time, I ran into visa problems. They took, let's say, almost a decade. And in the middle of this, I started having doubts about whether this was the right thing to do. And after a lot of thought, the concept of moving back to Europe, basically uprooting my life and moving back to Europe seemed impossible. And so I decided to try and explain what it was about America and its culture and the country itself that had drawn me in that strongly that I couldn't leave, basically. And the best way for me to describe that, I figured, was to go and re-experience the country on my own and to write about it and hopefully find an answer to that question, why America? Now, whether I answered it fully, I don't know. I think that the book is, I think I answered parts of that question in the book. I think the one thing that stands out from the whole trip is the openness and friendliness of the American people in general towards outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean myself arriving in a town that I'd never been in and sitting down in the first bar at 7 in the evening and starting conversations with people, which even in the depths of North Dakota or in the most rural, in the most rural places you can imagine that you would think would be insular and wary of foreigners, turned out to be some of the most open, and their willingness to integrate almost anyone.
Interesting.
Which is unique because most other countries, being based on either a nationality or a background or a religion, don't have that. And I think that's one of the things that makes this country incredibly unique.
Did you like pre-think out your road trip, or was it more like, I'm going to cover the entire United States and see if there's difference in the experience?
I had it out. I knew I wanted to do the whole country. Okay. And I knew I wanted to do a big circle, right? Okay. And I had a general outline of what I wanted to do. And I knew that I wanted to go through the northern states in winter in order to experience that season, which I think is what makes the North and the people different from the rest of the country, is that they have to live through these long months of ice, you know, bone-chilling cold. Changes their lifestyle, their interaction with each other, and so on. I did a stint through Canada, and I crossed over the border into the U.S. in Montana in the middle of a blizzard. And again, that the lady at the border patrol lady at the U.S. Customs turned out was half German and had grown up in Germany. So it was these weird experiences that I think, had it just been, you know, summer with a bunch of tourists and everything going across, it wouldn't have been, you know, those things might not have happened.
So you kind of had an idea, but it seems like you were looking for that extemporaneousness. It wasn't.
I was looking for, I had ideas of what I wanted to see. I had a guidebook that I worked from. I had a Michelin guide that I worked for, that I was working from, a green guide. And I had ideas of places that, like, it sounds really weird, but I had certain places that place names that you know from songs and stuff, you know, that I wanted to find. So those were my basic markers. But on the East Coast, on the West Coast, that was fine. In the North, going across the country, that was fine. It got complicated on the East Coast because I had to do a lot of zigzagging back into the hinterland, right? Away from the coast to see things that were on my list that I wanted to see.
It's one thing to decide to do a road trip. It feels like quite a big event in someone's life.
It was a year and a month. First, let's say 10 months, 9.5 to 10 months. I was full of enthusiasm, full of energy, and it was fantastic. The last 2 months, it started to become draining. Yeah. And you start getting that feeling that I imagine, you know, musicians get when they're on the road for too long. You get this, it becomes this continuous deadening rhythm of driving and stopping and spending the night in a hotel. And you get so sick of the motels and the hotels at some point.
You make some commentaries about some of the uniqueness of American culture. What were some of the things or moments that kind of like go, that's it, that's what I was looking for?
I don't think there was one. I think that the one thing that stuck with me was the fact that in a year of traveling, I can count on one hand the negative experiences I had with people, which in a year of driving around a whole country is pretty amazing. One of those people happened to be a German guy who I ran into in a bar in Washington who was completely antisocial. And which surprised me, because I was like, I would imagine that, to me at least, that's how I function. If I see somebody who speaks my language somewhere in a foreign country, I'd sort of, you know, you'd have a conversation with the person, right? Mm-hmm. But that was completely, but again, who knows what it had to do with? Maybe the guy was having a bad day. I have no idea. I got recommended to go to certain places like Williston, North Dakota. I would have never gone there had it not been recommended to me in Fargo, right? It was this sort of random interaction with people. And then there's the whole concept of what holds America together, which is another valid question. Yeah. Considering the variety and considering the distinct cultures, backgrounds, climates, everything that we have. What holds it together? Well, one of the things is it has to do with commerce. As an American, you can move from Northern California to Northern Maine and not really change much of your life. You're still going to Costco. You're still going to Walgreens. You're still speaking English. Okay, there might be a different accent. But your general day-to-day, that routine of life doesn't really change. Yeah. Which makes the labor market in America incredibly fluid, which allows people to move around all around the country. That in Europe, despite the European Union and despite everything that's been done to try and homogenify and unify Europe, it's still impossible. Because the guy from Hamburg, right, who grew up in Hamburg, who speaks German and who, okay, he learned English in school, if he has a job offer in Birmingham, it's not like, he's not going to jump because there's that, yeah, he speaks English, but there's a massive barrier. He has to completely relearn his life. Same thing with the French guy who grew up in Lyon and gets a job offer in Madrid. It's unlikely that he's going to take that job. But the distance is the same as moving from Chicago to New York, if not less. So there's that fluidity in America, which is unique in such a huge country.
I was going to ask you about your background that you discuss at the beginning of the book,
Right.
because for me, your background helps me to understand how you move through the landscape and experience the culture and places.
But I think at the end of the day, anybody who does a trip like that, what he picks out from everything that's available is influenced immensely by what their hobbies are, what their background is.
Oh, sure.
You know, those kind of things. Now you see there's a lot of car museums in there. Why? Because I'm a massive car nut. There's a bunch of air museums in there because through osmosis, through my father, there's this familiarity with aircraft. There's, I don't know. What else? I mean, from the background, did you see that
you have a little bit of, I want to say, a little bit of the Catholic background led you to see some of the Catholic history in different places, or that
maybe that was the cathedrals and stuff like that. But I think that's also a European thing, because in Europe, if you travel, the cathedrals in the cities and in the towns and the churches are always mostly some of the most interesting architecturally and historically places to visit. You see, I think that's a general European thing.
And they're central to the city too. They're usually in the center.
Yeah, central to the whole city architecture in Europe. Yeah, I think that's where that comes from.
Well, there was also, I felt, a layer of popular culture too, as well, that I really enjoyed. The music or movies, like the choices of visiting locations, which that to me is, I think most of us just living in modern society, but
that had a lot to do. I mean, I grew up speaking English at home. I've never set foot in a German school in my life. I spent all my schooling in English and then later on in Switzerland, partly French, and so on. So, but most of my pop culture education as a kid, because of my familiarity with English, came from America, came from American movies, came from what was on the radio, which already in the 80s was mainly mainly English language stuff, right? And I can still vividly remember watching old American TV shows and stuff in Switzerland, ironically dubbed in French. Stuff like, you remember Chips? Yeah, that kind of stuff, Starsky and Hutch and all that stuff. For some strange reason, because, Switzerland still wasn't very very multilingual, it was all dubbed in French. But nevertheless, it was American culture. It was American pop culture that was already prevalent in Europe at the time. I think that has something to do with it too.
You asked of the book, why America? And do you feel like you came to some conclusion or some sense of completion at the end of the road trip?
It's a tough question, and it's one that came up again and again during the writing of the book. As I was writing the chapters, as I was editing it, as I was doing all that, that question came up again and again. I don't think there is one answer.
Yeah.
The answer is different for everybody. I don't think I answered the whole thing. I think I did in some ways. I answered it to me because the main answer to the question for me is because this is where I feel the most comfortable, at home. At the same time, if you told me today, that's it, you have to spend the rest of your life in the US, you can never go back to Europe, I would be desperate, right? But at the same time, if you told me, that's it, you got to leave America, you got to move back to Europe full time, you can never come back to America, I would be equally desperate. So it's kind of weird. It's weird. I mean, I recognize I'm kind of split between the two, but that's part of my background. I think that's unavoidable. But I do feel more comfortable here, and I do feel more at home, whatever that means, in America. Considering that I've done all my education in English, I feel much more comfortable in English on a day-to-day basis. My German's fluent, yes, but I feel more comfortable and less rusty in English than I do in any other language. I'm sure that that would change if I, went to, Germany for 3 months, that would start to change. Same thing if I went to France for 3 months, the French would come back and it would start to change. But America's my mother tongue, if you will, my ad hoc kind of mother tongue.
So in some ways it was kind of a search for a subjective understanding or an existential understanding of what is home, and coming to terms with
it is right.
And home is a very key geographic concept for us because it's both the person, the individual, and environment, kind of putting it all together in one. So yeah, no, thank you for sharing this time with us.